Okie dokie. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the June edition of the SONA webinar, which is all about data today. We're talking about data-backed care, how to start building a data-driven culture for all. I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes while people are joining the room. But as people are joining, just a couple of little housekeeping bits. All of the opinions that are expressed today are the speaker's own. We will also have a chat function used on Livestorm today where you can contribute to the conversation. Please do ask loads of questions and get involved. We'd love to hear your thoughts as we go. As you will have seen, we'll also be giving out the URL for the KPI cheat sheet that all attendees will be getting today. And we'll talk a little bit more about that about halfway through the webinar. And I'll give you a little show and tell of what that looks like, but that will also be emailed out alongside the recording of the webinar after the session. We're also going to have a bit of a dashboard demo at the end with Jana from SONA coming on to talk about how SONA dashboards are a really good way to help optimize your data. And she'll be giving us a bit of a walkthrough of how that looks right at the end of the session. So that's pretty much the housekeeping. Kicking straight off, can we get some intros in? So Paul, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Morning, everybody. So I'm Paul, one of the Pauls from Nourish Care. So I'm the head of data and analytics at Nourish. So I've been with Nourish for about 3 years, but my background is social care through and through. I've been a support worker, registered manager, behaviour trainer, night staff, domestic, blah, blah, blah. I've kind of done all kinds of jobs within that space. So then about 3-4 years ago, I started getting much more heavily into the data side of things and stopped being a registered manager. But so that's me.
Great. And should we pass over to Katie?
Thanks, Holly. Morning, everybody. Hi, I'm Katie. I'm project lead for Digital Social Care. We're a project which is run by the Care Provider Alliance, so the National Trade Associations for Adult Social Care, funded by the NHS England predominantly, and provides sort of free support and guidance to adult social care providers across England around technology, data protection, and cybersecurity. Like Paul, my background's also social care. My family had a nursing home growing up, so I've worked basically every job in a nursing home at some point or another, other than being a nurse. I'm not a registered nurse, I will say. So that's sort of how I really feel that technology can really help us in the sector, because I've sort of used it firsthand.
Amazing. And hand it over to Richard.
Hi, so I'm Richard. I'm the head of product at SONA, so I look after everything that we're building here from the product perspective. But prior to that, I spent the last 10 years also working in care, and just like the other two speakers, I started in the care home, started as a waiter of all things. I've done care, I led the activities for a portion of time before spending the last 5 years implementing tech solutions throughout the business and deriving data insights from those systems and trying to help drive business change off the back of that. So bit care focused before joining the team here at SONA.
Amazing. Thanks, guys. Such great backgrounds for this conversation. So on that note, I'm going to kick straight off into question 1. So I would love to know, really generally, how well you think the care industry is currently utilising data and analytics in a general sense. Let's kick off with Katie.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question. I think generally speaking, I'd say it's a bit of a mixed bag in the sector from what I see. I talk to a lot of care providers, a lot of different care homes, registered managers, and there are some people who have data dashboards coming out of their ears. You know, they're being really proactive, really innovative in how they're using data. And then there are some who may be being a little bit more traditional. I won't say they're not using data. Everybody is using data every single day. But I think it sort of is really, really varied from what I see at the moment. But I think I'm seeing sort of generally a positive trend in terms of people getting more and more interested in data, in the information they're collecting, and especially about how that can improve outcomes for people.
Amazing. Paul, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, Katie and I, when we met earlier, we both kind of said a mixed picture was the first thing we said, and I think that's completely valid. I think for me, to kind of echo Katie's thoughts, but from what I see from working with lots of different providers, is I'm still quite stuck, or a lot of providers still quite stuck in a very linear mindset. So we had a paper process before, we had a spreadsheet somewhere, and hey, isn't this great that we can now populate that spreadsheet with data and automate that process? But really all we're doing is just making that process faster. So it's not ignoring that needs to happen. We completely need that at board level. But I think the really exciting stuff for us is happening in a slightly different space, and where we can start using cross-contextual data, building holistic pictures of a person, and as a service and a region and so on and so forth. So I think for me, that's the exciting bit. We don't see too much of that going on at the moment, but I think that's going to change over the next little bit.
Yeah, and I'd build on that in as much as where you were in a world with sort of paper data or these things that were done monthly for the board or whatever it was. Now, not only can you cross-contextualize, but you have in many instances real-time data. And I think that's where the trend needs to start moving to, that actually I don't need to look at this at the end of the month for what happened last month. I can look at what's going to happen, where I have planning in that respect. And I can look at what happened yesterday and the day before to take much more direct action. And I think that's a shift in mindset that can only be realized once everybody's shifting over to more digital methods of data capture across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great start, guys. What do you think organizations fundamentally need to change to get more from the data that they've already got in their systems? What is it that companies need to do to make the most of this?
I'd love to kick off if I can, Holly, and I think we'll touch on something a little bit later. But number one is recognize the power of data, and have someone responsible for it. We see a lot of, I think, growing with systems, you tend to get systems administrators or people that look after the different bits. And as Paul was saying, where you can start to cross-contextualize this data, that starts to be powerful if you've got somebody in operations maybe looking at care planning, but somebody in HR might be looking at something that's on trend with the staff, someone in scheduling and payroll. And if they're siloed, that becomes very difficult to cross-contextualize. So it's actually recognizing that you want someone to pull this together, and where possible, providing that resource, knowing that you'll be able to make the optimizations and savings in other areas, but you have to have someone that's going to look after that data centrally, I believe.
Can I just sort of following on from that? Sorry, Paul. This is possibly something quite boring, but I think it's quite important to do some data mapping about what you actually have as a care home, because of the silos that Rich is talking about. You know, it's quite often people don't realize the sheer quantities of what you have. And if you don't know what you have, you can't think about, firstly, do you need to have it? Because, you know, possibly we're spending time collecting data that's sitting there not being used. It's taking time, but it's pretty unuseful at the end of the day. And once you know what you have, you can then start sort of thinking, you know, if you have that person who's sort of taking a lead and go, oh, how can we use these data sets? How can we be more proactive? And that, I think the data mapping exercise is never fun. Honestly, it's a lot of wandering around with a clipboard sometimes and being like, what is in this filing cabinet, or what's in this like computer folder? But once you have it, it's done, and it's so helpful.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Katie. I think for me, I think one thing to build on both of those parts is what Richard was saying, is having someone to own it, but having the right person to own it. So I think what we see a lot of is like larger providers maybe going out and they get a Power BI dev or a Tableau dev or someone that's, you know, used to be great on Excel and now they're going to do. And actually what we're not seeing a lot of is people going out and actually getting someone as almost like a product owner for that, and someone that can weave those stories together in new and interesting ways that are relevant, and going out and talking to the people that need to consume and use that data. That's the bit we don't see. So I think that's the bit in between. We can translate it from a process, which a dev can do, but then what we're actually doing with it, and that's the bit in the middle. That, as we know, is often the really hard part. But yeah, I think it'd be really interesting to see some providers trying to move into that.
Great. Thanks, guys. Really interesting. Moving on to a bit of a different question. How do we ensure accuracy and integrity of data when conducting analysis in a care home setting when there's lots of different people inputting with different opinions? So how do we maintain integrity in what we're doing? Rich, do you want to start us off with this one?
Yeah, apologies. My automatic light's just gone out, so I'm sat in the dark, but I can. So I think one of the important things, again, we're talking about this shift, and Paul will definitely, I think, have more to add here around sort of this shift to digital, for instance, care planning or digital scheduling or whatever it is, and that gets rid of a lot of free-form data entry. So when you've got a lot of people putting it in things like other fields or free text, these areas make things very difficult to collate and do anything meaningful. Other will mean 100 different things. And it's like, if you can help the user that's inputting the data, like the system should be able to provide as much, whatever it is, however they're inputting data in whatever form, it needs to be as uniform as possible. And that makes it harder for errors, I guess, to get in and keep things more integral. So it's all about trying to make that process as easy and simple as possible. Like, you can have really powerful data, but it doesn't have to be a scary data input method. It can be quick and easy. But yeah, I wonder if Paul wants to build on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we think a lot about, and I think there's different ways of mitigating it. I think so. Some of it's like Rich is saying, where we can make things easy for people and give someone a drop down or a multi-select or something like that, where we're confident these options are the kind of things that you need to say. That's really good. And it just makes also the life for the support worker a lot easier. So we're kind of directing you. And some of it, I think, is about asking the questions in the right way. So Katie and I were talking just before the call as well. We sometimes professionalize language to such an extent that sometimes support, what are they asking in this question? So I think we try and keep language quite simple and straightforward. There is a role for free text as well. So there are definitely things where we need the whole context about something particularly complex has happened. So we need that. So I think there are also some innovative things that we can do then on the data side, or how do we analyze that and how can we make that accessible for people on the other side of things. So I think there's a bit of a mix of things that we can do. Data validation is really important as well. So, we know if things are out of range. I remember, we used to have things that someone would have a BMI of like 1 million because, people were inputting things in centimeters instead of meters and that kind of thing. So those are easy bits of low hanging fruit that we can do, just checking that, you can't do out of range things. So I think it's a combination of lots of stuff. I think having a platform that feels accessible is really important as well. Just that it feels like I can drop in here and just go and do what I need to do quickly. So, but yeah, we can't stop it ultimately. Like, people will sometimes say things that we're maybe not completely comfortable with. And I think we need to be okay with that. And so the other side of the coin is the whole journey makes it much more transparent. So if we are seeing things like that, we can see it and discuss that quite quickly and kind of get in between that process. So yeah, that's how I see it. I think. Katie, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with what both of you have just said. As for me, I think it's also about a culture around data and data quality and making sure people are really bought into why it's important that we record these things. All of us probably have it in our jobs. If we're asked to do something and we don't know why, it feels a bit meaningless. We don't take a lot of care or time over it. Whereas when we're sort of saying, okay, I record this because it has this outcome or it's being used for this thing, you're a little bit more cautious about it. You take the time, you put care in. And I think that automatically sort of improves the quality of the data that you're getting. And also probably the amount of data that you're getting. If somebody's really bought in and knows that people are going to be reading this and using it, they're going to give you so much more about what happened during the day, rather than just like gave tea at 10. It might be said tea at 10, also had a biscuit, we had a chat, they seemed happy today. And that's all really, really valuable about the culture of when people have bought into this.
No, I totally agree, Katie. I think that's a huge one, is about really driving that adoption of understanding why you're doing something. Yeah, fantastic. Moving on. This is kind of a question for you, Paul, but everyone can jump in and give their opinions. But what are some innovative ways data analysis is being used to personalise care for individual residents in care homes?
I think I've probably revealed a bit of my opinion on this already from what we've already said. But I think a lot of it is about what's being collected, what kind of stories and what the outcomes are. So where we have seen really good, really good processes in place is when people have gone back to those questions, like what are we actually doing this for and what's the impact on the person, and thought deeply around that. I think some really interesting things around how data is actually presented. Again, Katie and I were talking, sometimes as soon as you mention data to certain people, it can feel a bit like I'm dropping into the matrix. Everything's going to be this weird world. And actually, one of the things we try and do is make the data feel quite accessible, even like friendly and kind of playful, that you can play with some of these elements and they might do some things which are unexpected or bring data across from other places. So there's, I think for specifics, I've seen some really great work around behavioural support. So trying to move away from incident crisis reporting. This is one of my sort of passion things, but trying to move away from incident crisis reporting much further before the event, so it's not already way too late for the people involved. So looking at that space around personalising what maybe some of the triggers for that behaviour are, triggers, and what the responses are, and allowing MDTs to become iterative through that process. I remember trying to do this on paper and it was a nightmare. So trying to do it with data makes it much, much more effective. So you can really understand what is it that we're doing, and is it working ultimately. So that's been a really key one that we've seen. So, but lots happening. I feel like the next 18 months are going to be huge. I think as all the maturity and momentum comes into the space and all the integrations start clicking in, I think that's going to be huge.
Has anyone else got anything to add on that point?
I think to weigh in very quickly, like Paul saying, not the onus, but I think there's also an opportunity for providers that are collecting this data en masse across lots of different organizations and lots of different settings to be able to lead the way. And I think we're seeing a lot more of that, certainly with the likes of Nourish and other providers, where it's actually, we kind of know what good looks like, or we know what something looks like, given the fact that we have not just a few hundred people collecting some data potentially, but tens of thousands and so on. And it's recognizing that and having actually some people be like, obviously in anonymized and sensitive manners and treating the data with all of the respect it deserves, but being able to be like, this chart or this graph or this way of analyzing the data has driven this change in these organizations, and recognizing companies that are doing it well and visualizations that are helping. Because to touch on the point again, to hash over old ground, you don't have to look at it at the end of the month now, right? Like you've got this real, it's like, this is a new chart or a new metric that I can look at in real time and track. And sometimes the people that are holding the most data might be able to steer that conversation.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I guess is sort of one of the areas I'm finding really interesting at the moment is sort of where you're seeing integrations between different software platforms and the way that they're working together. I don't know if I'm allowed to sort of mention company names, so I won't. But, there's some really interesting stuff around sort of AI pain monitoring and sort of using like facial scanning at the moment. And that's being used as sort of a diagnosis tool for that support tool, not to replace a carer, but to support that sort of diagnosis of somebody whose pain might be increasing, particularly if they have dementia and they find it hard to articulate their pain. And then we're seeing sort of early research which shows that actually reduces the amount of medication that somebody's have to have, or like more targeted medication, which can also have impacts on reducing falls. So some of that becomes incredibly personalized really quickly, but it's only possible because you've got multiple different software platforms integrating and working together. And I think that's a really interesting space.
If I can just grab 2 seconds on the end of that, Katie, because I know the platform you're talking about and they're great.
Yeah.
Probably won't mention them. But I think that the integration stuff is so interesting and it's going to be so powerful, because you've got this data over here, and then you've got some context data about the person's wider life and what's happening with them. The insights you can gain from that are really huge. And I think that's the really exciting stuff when you start to break out of these silos and come together. The really, really difficult stuff about running a care home or a location, and supporting people to really understand who they are and what's making their lives better, I think comes from that. So yeah, definitely an exciting time.
Fab, thanks guys. I'm going to move on to the next one now. So this is where we get into the depths of metrics. So what key metrics and indicators should be being monitored to assess the quality of care provided in care homes at the moment? What are the kind of key things that we should be looking for? Who wants to start us off? Paul, maybe?
Yeah, again, Katie and I were talking about this. It's a really long list, right? It's like a massive shopping list. I think, and just touching on something Richard was saying earlier, I think what we're seeing now, we work with lots and lots of groups, is lots of people do specific things really, really well, but there are commonality, but that maybe no one else does, in quite the same way, and people have specialisms, and we don't want to lose that. So it's about finding the common threads for benchmarking that run across lots and lots of companies. So some things that jump to mind might be like agency ratio or agency percentage. We know that that's really huge and can be an indicator of the quality of support being provided. Incident ratio, so how many incidents of type X do you have? So there's lots of KPIs there. I'm kind of in that board mentality again of, okay, well, these are things that we have on a sheet somewhere. I think outside of that, I think all of us could be doing a better job at just keeping it really simple and just asking people how they're doing. How was your day? Do you like living here? And appreciate that maybe not everyone can answer those questions, but there might be someone that can kind of give an opinion around that, how that person seems and feels. So, and the same for staff as well, just keeping it really, I'm a massive fan of plain language, as you can tell at this point, but just literally asking, like, do you like working here? How was your shift? And I think that kind of thing we could all do a better job at. So yeah, but yeah, a very long list. Katie, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that one as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I absolutely agree about sort of the well-being questions. I think that's so important to really understand, not just for the residents, but also for staff, and asking more regularly and in different ways as well, through different formats. I think particularly when you've got night staff, I know it's always quite difficult to understand their experiences. Retaining night staff, always a bit of a pain. So can we think about how we find out how they're feeling? Can we be more proactive? Proactive is apparently my buzzword for this webinar. I'm really sorry. But, like, how can we respond to concerns, to queries? I think that's all really vital. I mean, obviously I come from a nursing home background, so I think anything to do with medication is also really important, understanding medication errors and what's happening with medication, if people are having more. So that's something else that I'd throw in.
And yeah, just to add, I think touching on the night staff and the retention issue, or like the sort of satisfaction of the staff, is really interesting. That again, not in some metrics around the management of care homes, like home managers or care managers of whatever, they are magic. They deal with testament to Paul for his years doing it, right? But it's like they deal with such a wide, diverse set of issues, like looking after staff, the residents, but actually how they're doing is much less of a black box, or can become much of a less of a black box now with the data and the metrics. So it's a case of you can start to set KPIs that aren't just occupancy must be X and that turnover must be Y. It can be like what leads to that, or how can you do it? And once you start to get a layer deeper, there starts to be meaningful actions. And then suddenly all of this data, the scary data, the matrix becomes, oh, because of X, I need to do Y. That's how I deliver excellent care. So I think it's starting to take those steps away from these high-level board KPIs down to what does it mean for me as a manager or as a team leader or as whatever role it might be that I have. And that's what I'd like to see with some KPIs and some spoilers, I think, on the cheat sheets. It's starting to look a little bit smaller, that actually will then have a bigger impact.
Amazing. Thanks, Richard. And that's a perfect segue into me going and introducing the KPI cheat sheet that everyone that's attended today will be able to access. So let me just share my screen and very quickly intro this to you. So this is the Sona version of the KPI cheat sheet. As I said, everyone will have access to this at the end of the session today. So we've put together some really relevant KPIs across all kind of areas of your business, so staff, the people you're supporting, and then also to do with your turnover and margin. So there's some really tangible and achievable targets on here that you can have a look at after today's session. Things as simple as NPS scores, getting some surveys out and seeing what people are thinking of after their shifts, the things we've spoken about, agency staff and safe staffing. So really, really important KPIs. And yeah, I think Tom is going to pop the link in the chat now, should you want to just go and have a little look as we go for the rest of the webinar. But we will be sharing that after today's session. So fabulous. Moving swiftly on to the next question. I'd love you guys to talk a little bit about how we can use data analysis to optimize resource allocation and budgeting in care homes, as this is such a huge problem. So yeah, I don't know, Katie, would you like to kick us off this one?
Yeah, of course. So one of the ways that I found when I was still working in a nursing home that data could be really, really useful is actually around sort of relationships with commissioners. I think we were a very small single site nursing home, over 50% sort of publicly funded care, mainly local authority funded, so had a lot of commissioning conversations. And what we found with the data that we were collecting is that actually the more we had and when it was digitized, we really understood the cost of the care that we were delivering. We could evidence that back to our commissioners. So when it came in terms of sort of contract negotiation and sort of, that whole sometimes very stressful experience, rather when we were on paper, it was hard to do, but suddenly we had this data sort of at our fingertips and we could go, this is what we've done and, how this is helping. And that entire experience was just so much better. And it really helped us in terms of our overall sort of budget and also relationships with our commissioners. So I think that's a great way. Paul and I chatted earlier and he mentioned efficiency. So I don't know, Paul, if you wanted to talk about that at all, but I think that's also a key area in this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's no exaggeration to say I used to literally have nightmares about trying to balance my budget, my resource against the needs of the students that we had. It's a hugely, hugely complex job. And so I think, we can definitely make it more efficient. I think from our side, what we can do is provide data around, sounds awful, but like kind of the demand side, like how much support do people need and what type of support is there and how much support has been provided, exactly what Katie was talking about earlier. Having been in lots of those funding meetings, it may have changed a little bit, but I kind of doubt it. I feel like that it used to feel like a very adversarial process, particularly when it's tripartite and you've got three funding bodies all trying to kind of, well, this definitely feels like health, and no, this definitely feels like social care. Well, we can kind of get in the middle of that now, right? Because these things, they're all, we've done this type of activity with a person. Well, that's either going to fit in this box, or this box. So I think hopefully we'll start to see less of that adversarial process on both sides. It should feel much more evidence-based, which hopefully will smooth everything out. But completely agree with Katie. We've worked with a couple of companies where they've been able to go back to the commissioners and just say, here it is, this is what we've done. And it kind of becomes a bit incontrovertible, so they're really helpful and it helps them have very transparent information when they're going back to their budgets are tight. They have a really difficult job as well, So I think it's just trying to bring us all together and again break out of those silos. So yeah, definitely, yeah.
Building on that, like the next stage, I guess. So once that bit's sort of sorted, then you do know what the care is or what the budgets are. It's part of it can just be visibility. Like if so take a supported living setting, for instance, if you know that Jeff is being funded for 10 hours of one-to-one care and 50 hours of shared care with 5 other people, it's like that needs to be easy to key into the roster. It needs to be visible. It's like as the shifts are going in, yes, John's working his contracted hours, that's fine, but is Jeff getting those 10 hours of one-to-one care? Is he getting those 50 hours of shared care? And are the other people who he's sharing care with included in getting it? It's like the visibility. And then again, we talk about this real-time tracking. Suddenly you can look at your rotas next week and be like, are we going to deliver the commission hours that we need to? And you look at then what happened last week. Once everyone did clock in and out and provide, did we provide that care? It's like this visibility about that level down. And then in a slightly different setting, I guess, to build on in a care home, once you've worked out maybe what your peaks and troughs of care are, so obviously the mornings are a busy time, and then maybe you have a trough. It's at the moment, I think it's very easy when you're on paper. It is genuinely an impossible problem for a person to solve, to start saying, what shift lengths do I need to cover these peaks, not the troughs, but also not have too many people on that are, but also there are some tasks where I need people that aren't providing care to be cleaning. That's a very, very difficult problem for people. It's a very, very easy problem for computers because there are finite answers and you can start to put in rule sets, and we need to start. I'm yet to see a hugely successful auto scheduler. If anyone wants to put in the chat something that they've used that's working, I genuinely, that would be fascinating. But we're starting to get to a world where with the right data and the right inputs, you're like, I need this many people for these 15-minute intervals of the days. What should a shift look like? Should it be a 12-hour and a 6-hour shift? Or actually, is there a 4-hour shift that somebody can work once they've taken their child to school, that they can get it these sort of more flexible hours? And then suddenly you're not losing money on staffing that you don't need, but you do have the right people in the right place at the right time when you need them.
I'm just going to add one tiny bit on that, Richard, if that's okay. I completely agree with all of that. I think where it would be really interesting is there's another dimension to that too, right? It's not just the number of people, but it's the complexity of the support that needs to be provided. So, there's a bunch of training data that we have over here in HR, and then we have a bunch of risk assessments and all the kind of care planning and support planning data over here. So bringing those two together, I think, is is really important, because sometimes it's having the right people on the right shift at the right time as well, isn't it? Which makes it just, like you say, it's completely impossible, almost impossible to do it well as a person. You just kind of sit there going, oh my gosh. So yeah, but a straightforward problem for
it couldn't agree more. And with potentially different salary bands for different people with different skills, it's making sure it's the right people. So I don't potentially have all of my team leads on one day that goes really well and was maybe quite expensive, and then I'm lacking that later in the week. So I agree, it's the right skill mix for all of those training needs. And yeah, that again, we come back to integrations, right? Let's get all that data talking to each other.
Great, thanks guys. That was super interesting. So moving on, what are some examples of some successful data-driven interventions or initiatives that you've implemented in care homes to improve resident outcomes? I know that you guys have all got backgrounds working in care homes. So can you think of like any examples or any kind of things that we can talk about here?
I'm happy to go first. I'm sure everybody's got great examples, but I think this kind of actually ties back to what Richard was just saying as well. So I'm really excited by quite a lot of the overnight monitoring, like acoustic monitoring or sort of radar monitoring that is happening. We know quite often when you're going in person as a carer to check somebody overnight, you end up waking and disturbing their sleep, and then they could be up for several hours. So actually having data, which means that you can be proactively monitoring, there's that word again, I will stop saying it, I promise, but like not actually interrupting sleep for people who struggle, I think is important. But also for people who do routinely get up in the night, and you may have lower staffing levels, so you don't necessarily have somebody who can sit with them for 15 minutes or half an hour and, you know, have a chat. If you know that somebody is always up at 2 a.m. because you have the data to see it, you can start looking a bit more about sort of, oh, do I want to have sort of another member of staff on at that point, and maybe reduce it elsewhere because it's not needed quite as much at that time, so that that person's getting really individualized care. They have someone to talk to at that time, and then, you know, they can go back and have more restful sleep. They're less of a full risk and that sort of thing. So I think some of that technology and, you know, linking it with the staff rostering systems is really interesting.
Great. Paul, have you got anything to add to that one?
I mean, that was one of the ones I was going to mention as well. Katie talked about it. No, absolutely. It was, yeah, we had a similar system at the last provider I worked at, and it's great. You know, it really changes the relationship, particularly around nights, which is a really complex time, often with not many people on shift. So yeah, completely agree with you, Katie. I think I mentioned it before, but I've seen some really interesting work around behaviour and people, you know, looking at kind of root cause analysis and things like that. So I think we're starting to see things move the needle there. Some specific ones around falls and sort of trying to mitigate those. We're always talking about how we can't do falls prevention, because falls prevention is, you know, going around and kind of tying people to a chair or something. We can't prevent it, but we can to some extent predict it. And we had one provider that did some really interesting work and just literally just tracking a few different metrics, and kind of came down to, actually we have a bunch of people that if we give them a drink at a certain time of night, they're often wanting to get up to go to the loo in the middle of the night, and then they're falling. So if a person wants to have a drink quite late, well, we know that, so we can put a little bit of extra support around them. So those kind of things. I think what Katie and I did talk about earlier at the moment is what we're seeing in quite singular cases. So what we're trying to do is encourage people to come together, particularly some of the smaller providers where maybe they don't have the resources to be able to do it themselves, or they're just a part of that puzzle. So coming together and not be in a competitive space, but how can we share what we're learning? And Katie was talking about some of the things she's doing around that, which sounds really interesting, and I'm going to try and join. So yeah, I think that would be great, some more collaboration in the space, so that we can start sharing the learnings and building a much bigger picture. Richard, I don't know what you have to add to that one.
Yeah, I'll take a slightly different angle. What I've seen done really well is ask the care staff. And it sounds so stupid and so simple, but they have arguably all of the answers. A, there's loads of them. B, they're great. They go to work for a reason, right? They care. And the more touch it can be easy to look at sort of almost top down or like big picture and be like, oh, if we do this to care, it's like, ask a care. Like if you've got consistent feedback, and again, it's not this like annual survey of like, how are you? Maybe it's weekly, or there's much more. Real time, proactive is Katie's buzzword. I think real time might be mine. It's like there's much more real time data you can get from the people on the ground. And the examples I've seen before range from anything from changing the food that's on a certain day when residents were miserable because they hadn't eaten enough, they didn't like what was getting, right through to any ambitious idea about changing activities. Or actually, if we did this in this order, more staff, more residents would be able to come down and benefit from the dining room, for instance, I've seen before, because actually it's just the timings of the day when things are happening. And it's those micro details that can have a big impact on the residents' quality of life. So it is, for me, it's like the most effective way to get feedback from your workforce is the best way to improve the quality of life of your residents.
Fab. Yeah, that's a really great sentiment to end on there. That's fantastic. Thanks, guys. Moving on, what do we think that suppliers can do to aid providers that may not have the resources for actual data lead or a dedicated data person? What can providers do in that sense? Let's choose Katie to kick off.
I guess I should say I'm not a supplier, so I guess both Paul and Richard would probably be able to go into more detail about that. But what I see in general is that most software suppliers, like nearly all of them, and I spent a lot of time talking to software suppliers in this sector, have really great training options, will really work with staff and staff teams to sort of on not only how to use their product, but how to get the best out of it. And I think that's really, really important in this space. I think where you don't have a data lead, and most care homes are never going to have one, I don't think. I think we're too small, generally speaking, to have sort of an entire data analysis department, unfortunately. But working with your suppliers and how they can help you is great. I also think, and not the dashboards and the reporting and the sort of real time, as using Richard's buzzword on this one, that we can see now within these systems does make it easier to interact with data, to really sort of actually have that in a way which is both easy to digest, but also usable and useful. And I think that's massively changed. Excel is great. I love Excel, but it's not particularly user-friendly for everybody. So when you have things presented in a way which is more meaningful, which you can then share with your staff teams or with your senior directors or owners or boards, whatever your sort of structure is, I think the software itself, just from how it's built, is helping with this. I don't know, Paul or Richard, if you want to come in with some specifics on this one.
So I think I've got sort of 2 points here that hopefully are relatively interesting. Number one being like the smaller providers, if you're a supplier, having these generic dashboards that we talked about, that actually the smaller providers can benefit from those larger ones. So most of our larger customers, for instance, have very specific data. And I care about this, and it has to be in this format because that's how my organization works. And I've got 5,000 people across God knows how many sites. And it's like, that's fine. And you need the ability to have that sort of custom reporting and things, but it's then passing on these out of the box products that if you don't have that desire and knowledge necessarily in-house, it's like, well, here's 10 dashboards that are really working for people that they're gleaming insight from. But so that's, I guess, one thing that suppliers can do is almost share the knowledge and be like, here's a method that lots of other people seem to be using. Like, how does it work for you? But the other angle on that is that dashboards, again, real time, it's not at the end of the month. It should drive action. If I'm looking at data, apologies, I'm now sat in the dark again. If I am looking at data, it's for a reason. These numbers mean I need to do X or I need to do Y, and having that all in one place, I think, is really important as well. It's not just seeing that, residents are unhappy or residents are falling all the time. It's like, okay, you've had X falls because of Y staffing, or pulling those things together. And as a manager, I know I need to do this. So it's having those action-driven insights, I think, which is where suppliers can really help.
Amazing. Paul, have you got anything to add there?
I think, kind of just building on both of the points from Katie and Richard, I think connecting providers, the smaller providers, so they can pull resources and thoughts and their kind of skills, I think is really important. I think definitely what Richard was saying about disseminating knowledge that we kind of maybe gained from working with some of the really large suppliers that have a very large, very dedicated QA department of very highly skilled people. There is a degree of kind of that then trickles down into the product. So we have to be a bit careful around IP, and some people have some very, very specific things which are part of their DNA, what makes them a really amazing organization. So we have to be really sensitive and mindful of that. But where there are commonalities and it doesn't kind of cross over into that space, yeah, we want to share that. And Richard was saying before, we're all in the space for people to have better lives. So yeah, I think the general impetus is in that direction, that people want to work together. They're just not always quite sure how to get there. So yeah, keep trying to build on that.
Perfect. I'm going to very quickly go into one more question before we do a bit of a Q&A. So if anyone has got any questions that they've accumulated over the last half hour, please do pop them in the chat now so we can go through them in a moment. But finally, last question, how do you encourage teams to ask questions surrounding that data that is collected? We've talked a lot about how we champion teams and make sure they're aware of why we're collecting data, but how do we encourage them to ask questions? Richard, you look like you want to start.
Luckily, I was on mute as well, so thanks for calling me out there. I just picking up on what Katie said earlier, that is a lens I hadn't necessarily thought of before this, but it's the context. If the staff fully understand what is happening with that data, and it doesn't have to be like a 2-hour lecture, it's little inputs about we have this because of that. The more context they have, then the more empowered they'll become to challenge. But if you want this, shouldn't you maybe be asking this or that? And I could tell you this, which is more useful. And again, it all comes down to, I think the workforce themselves are the best asset. The more they know, the more empowered they are. I think that's what brings it up, rather than being like, you have to do this. It's like, we want to achieve this. It's like, what's the goal? We believe this will help us. And then you'll be amazed at where the input comes from the staff about, yeah, cool, that's one way of doing it, but how about this? Or how about that?
When I read the question last night, I took it in a completely different direction. I was thinking about us and our team and how we ask questions internally and how we think about it, because we have to be really mindful of that too. And Katie and I were talking earlier about how, where we've got data from lots of sources, the picture that you can make is really comprehensive. So we have to be really mindful of, like, actually, does a person want us to make this kind of picture? Because we have access to it doesn't necessarily mean it's right. So I think one of the things that's really important for me and our team is that we have people with social care backgrounds. It's really funny that we all have on this call, but that really changes the conversation. So we don't just have kind of a cave of devs somewhere just coding away on stuff, and you can lose sight of the human being on the end of it. So I was with a team yesterday, and we were building a report around some very specific KPIs they wanted, particularly around weight monitoring. And we noticed what we thought was some erroneous data around a very high MUST score. And we kind of dig into it. We were like, actually, this is right, and this is a person that's really unwell, and it really brings it home. So we try and be mindful of that internally. And I think it's probably the same for providers. It's easy to get lost in the KPIs and the metrics. So I think just keeping it really human keeps us on track and is a good kind of cheesy but North Star for all of us. There's someone on the end of all of this stuff. Yeah, that's important to us. Richard.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I don't know if I really have much more to add on that. I completely agree with both of you. I think they're really important points. I guess probably not a question for today, maybe a later discussion, is sort of the next phase from that. Once your sort of teams are on board, how are we involving residents and the people we support as well in these conversations about data? It's their data most of the time anyway. So I think that sort of is something that we should be thinking about much more meaningfully as well as a sector.
Amazing. Thank you, guys. That was so insightful. It's so great that you guys have all got the same kind of background in care homes to be able to give really tangible experiences. So thank you so much for that. We have got a couple of questions in the chat that I'll just quickly run through. Feel free to pick up whichever one you feel relates to you the most. But the first one is from Debbie, just asking, what would you highlight as some key outcome metrics that we should be measuring? Anyone got a first point?
Super
bored, right? I'll let Paul. I think Paul will probably talk more of the resident.
Oh, Debbie, it's such a great question, and not knowing your provider, I guess, is a bit hard to look at. But definitely some interesting things that that I think people could be doing is looking at goals and outcomes for people much more. We tend to, I think, the data focus on things that have gone wrong, adverse events and things like that, and not quite so much on the, I've set this goal for myself and how can we track progress towards that? Because data is really, really good at that, and really, really good at having the bigger picture that actually, okay, I didn't do so well for the last couple of weeks, but I've had all this other stuff going on. So actually I've still made positive progress. So I think it sounds a bit cheesy, like outcomes for the outcomes for people, but goal setting and how we get there and how efficient or effective teams are in getting there, and then sharing best practice would be a really key one for me.
Yeah, I agree on that sort of sharing best practice. I think the KPI sheet that you guys have created as well is incredibly helpful for this, but it's really different for different organizations. The sector is so huge, provides so many different types of care to so many different individuals with different needs. It's quite hard to pick just one. So we're really proactive at Digital Social Care. We want to bring care providers, registered managers together to have conversations about data and to share some of that. So we do sort of a monthly data cafe. Anyone can drop in and have a chat with their peers and sort of say, hey, we're thinking about this might be a helpful outcome. Is anyone else doing it? And sort of sharing some of those stories. And what I've kind of learned from those conversations is everyone's really different, but everyone's got some great ideas, and learning from each other is really useful in this space. So it's probably a bit of a wishy-washy answer, that one.
Rich, anything to add?
No, given the fact there's a couple of extra questions, I might, I think it's broad. I think the cheat sheet's going to be probably a good starting point, and I just reiterate, small actionable KPIs for the individuals is how I would look at things.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. Moving on to the next question. What are some best practices for social care providers that are just starting to use data and analytics in their decision-making processes? So where do we start?
I think we'll go on, Paul.
No, you go for it, Richard. So I'm always jumping on this stuff. I'll be quiet.
I think it's not so much where to start, but one common pitfall potentially that I've seen is data is super important, can drive decisions, but when you're just starting out, it's really easy to overcorrect and be like, the data said X, so we have to do Y. And it's always try and contextualize it. Again, Paul said earlier, there's always a need for free text. There's always a need for like a series of things might have happened, but they may be anomaly. When you're just starting out, it's quite hard to know what it's like. It's fairly unhelpful and quite broad, but it's like, don't overcorrect. It's like, let the data lead you, but don't be led blindly by the data bizarrely. Like is look for the reasonings and look for trends before you start trying to take actions, is I think how I would approach it on the offset.
I think for me, something I see a lot when I'm first starting training and onboarding with people is be clear about, so start small. And so be clear about like your couple of most important things that you want to solve that are going to have the biggest impact for you, both in terms of time and the outcomes for the people. But the other thing, I think, have in the back of your mind some of those questions that like, we wish we could have found out this. Like, so when I was talking earlier about behavior, I used to do behavior support all the time, drive all these MDTs, and we could just never get there. So trying to have this still in my mind of like, what's the kind of big thing that we wish we could do that we just can't at the moment. So a bit of that, very pragmatic, start small, get something deliverable that's going to have big impact, keep the big stuff in the back of your mind, and be imaginative and innovative. And you never know, there often are good ways of doing this. You just have to kind of think it through with your teams, but please start small. Don't try and do your entire QA calendar in your first week. So.
That's some really good advice, Paul. Thank you for that. And finally, there's one more question in the chat. Just how would you quantify and track employee satisfaction? What should we measure?
Go on, Katie, after you.
I guess this is maybe a bit of a stretch point on it, but I think the most important thing around tracking and quantifying employee satisfaction is actually being able to demonstrate back to your employees that you are acting on what they're telling you. You know, you could do daily like check-in, like do a smiley face emoji or a sad face emoji, but if you're not doing it, you're not going to get meaningful information from your staff at all. So there's lots of different ways of doing it. I've seen people doing like great things around sort of emoji usage, so it's short, you're not overburdening staff with feedback forms and that sort of thing. It's also more easy for you to quantify over a lifetime. But if you're not doing anything with it, you may as well not be at all, because it's just a way you're telling your staff that we're doing this because we've got to show this to CQC or to a quality inspector. We don't actually care. So I guess I would say that. Sorry, Richard, I jumped in before you on that one.
No, that is an absolute great point, and it's like little and often is my answer, but you're correct. It's little and often and show action. Like this, I quite like that you said we did things like that, but not on this annual basis. Like even if you have a 20-page questionnaire that you want to ask, if you've got a right tool, imagine if you asked 20 different people one question each day. You over a period of time, you still get that same rich data set, but you get a much better moving picture of it. So it's this idea that breaks out. You can stay, it doesn't have to just be emojis are great for how staff are feeling, but you can actually get even more rich data if you've got a sophisticated enough tool to spread out how you collect it and then show action. Whatever comes, show and own. And if you can't show action, if you can't take action and not everything is actionable, own it. This is a problem, or this is a thing that everyone's flagged. I understand it's a thing that's flagged. There's nothing I can immediately do about it, but I recognize, like, as a manager, that can be the hardest part, but it's true. Not everything's in your power, and it's owning that and being transparent, I think, with the feedback that comes in.
Amazing. Thank you so much, guys. That's a perfect way to round up today's webinar. You guys have been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us.